bring the word to us this morning, but we're just going to watch the brand new sermon opener first.
Faith is more than words. It requires action. It prepares for God to move. It builds an ark ready for the rain. It lines up the jars ready for the oil. It mends the nets ready for the catch. It prepares the way ready for Jesus to come. Like David, we prepare for the giants to fall. Like Mary, we prepare for the promise to be born. Like Moses, we prepare for the Red Sea to part. Like Joshua, we prepare for the walls to fall. Faith that attracts heaven calls for action. It requires expectation. It demands preparation. Faith tells us to get ready. Ready for more. Ready for an increase. Ready for an open door.
Well, good morning, everyone. As Pastor Shireen said, it's a great Sunday to be in church because if this is your first ever Sunday, we're all on the same page today because today is a brand new sermon series. It's going to run for 5 weeks, which we've called Prepare. And the whole idea behind the series can be summed up in this one statement, that our lives should look like preparation for all that God is going to do next. My guess is that many of us in the room today, we have this sense of expectation that our lives are on the edge of something. Like we sense that God has been nudging us, whether it's our personal life, whether it's our career, whether it's our family life, whether it's this church. For some of us, we sense that God has spoken to us like about a next chapter or a next part of the story. And our faith in what God has said will be demonstrated by our preparation. Because faith always has action attached to it. Sometimes as Pentecostals, we believe that God has spoken to us, and then we kind of hang around waiting for that suddenly moment as if God is going to download something in a second. But so often that's not how life works. Faith that attracts heaven looks like something. Like it is attached to action and it requires preparation. And so a couple waiting for the arrival of a baby, of course, they prepare. Like they prepare a nursery. Friends expecting friends to come round for a meal, they prepare their home for their guests to arrive. If you're expecting a flood, you prepare by building an ark. If you are preparing for a catch of fish, of course, you prepare for the catch of fish by mending the nets. I think you probably get the idea. Our lives should look like preparation for what God is going to do next. And so as a church right now, you know that we're believing that God is going to lead us to a brand new location. We believe, like on the day of Pentecost, that we should find a way for us all to be gathered in one place rather than in different services. But the thing you probably need to know is that we're not sitting around waiting for God to teleport us to a new location at the time that he sees fit. Firstly, we're praying. Like part of our preparation is prayer. And then secondly, we've done a variety of different things. We're in the process of speaking to the council. We've got a survey and evaluation done on this piece of land and on this building. And we're talking to our headquarters about the needs that we have as a church. And I tell you that because we believe that God has spoken to us, but our lives and our leadership, they should look like preparation for what God is going to do next. And it's not just about us as a church. It's about you in your own personal life as a follower of Jesus Christ, because your life should look like preparation for all that God is going to do next. Because what if the level of outpouring on your life was determined by your level of preparation? What if instead of just waiting around for God to do the thing that he said he's going to do, what if you took your life to a whole new level and you got ready for it to actually happen? Like you actually prepared for God to do the thing that he said he would do. And so for the next 5 weeks, we're going to take you to 5 different Bible stories. I guess most of them you'll be familiar with. They're stories about people who, in a step of faith, prepare for God to do a miracle. And so today I'm going to take you to 2 Kings chapter 4 and verses 1 to 7. A familiar story. It's the story of the prophet Elisha. He's about to perform one of his 28 recorded miracles, which just by the way is double the amount of miracles that Elijah performed. So Elijah performs 14 recorded miracles and then he passes the baton to Elisha. Elisha asks for a double portion and he doesn't perform 14 miracles. He performs 28 recorded miracles, which is of course a double portion. And for those of you who are Bible nerds, you knew that anyway. So here is verse 1 of chapter 4, 2 Kings 4. It says, the wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves. Elisha replied to her, how can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house? Your servant has nothing there at all, she said, except a small jar of olive oil. Elisha said, go round and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side. She left him and shut the door behind her and her sons. They brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. When all the jars were full, she said to her son, bring me another one. But he replied, there's not a jar left. Then the oil stopped flowing. She went and told the man of God, and he said, go sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left. I'm sure God will bless the reading of his word to us today. It's a beautiful story, isn't it? And it's a story probably that we struggle to understand, at least from a Western perspective, because of course we do have a welfare system, whether it works perfectly or not, but it does provide benefits for those who have very little. But in the context of this story, there is no housing benefits, there's no NHS, there's no widow's pension, there's none of that. And so this lady has nothing, and she has no one who can bail her out. Her husband has died, and he obviously brought the sole income into the house. When he dies, he leaves a large amount of debts, but he doesn't leave anything to pay those debts off. And so even though it sounds abhorrent to us, this lady is being forced to sell her sons into slavery in order to pay off those debts. And it's really easy to read those words without understanding the full depth of pain that that lady would have experienced. Fear, sadness, pain. I mean, these were her only 2 boys. These were the 2 boys that she'd weaned and she'd taught and she'd loved and she'd cherished. And now she's about to give those 2 boys away. They'd be taken from her. And the text says, therefore, that she cries out to Elisha. And you have to try to understand, just reading into the text, the pain that this lady is experiencing. She calls out to God's prophet, to Elisha, God's representative on the earth. She is desperate. Like she's about to lose her boys. She's never going to see them again. She has nowhere to turn. And so she cries out to God. Can I say just 2 things, 2 simple things in terms of introduction that is worth saying just on consideration of verse 1, and it's this. Firstly, that godly people still have troubles. It's worth remembering that godly people still have dark days of despair. Just because you are a follower of Jesus Christ doesn't mean that you're not going to have hard times. Please do not believe that like God channel YouTube preacher who tells you that when you become a Christian and you give your life to Christ, nothing bad is ever going to happen to you. Because that's just not true. Here we have a lady in the text who is married to a godly man. He's a prophet. He's close to God. He dies early and his finances are in a mess. And now this lady, this widow, faces ruin. But it's worth remembering that these were God-fearing good people. Folks, let me lift a bit of guilt off some of us today that says, just because you have experienced some stuff that's gone wrong in your life, it doesn't mean that you've done something wrong. It doesn't actually mean that God stopped loving you, and it doesn't mean that God is punishing you. It's just that life is like that sometimes. Unfortunately, Jesus looks his disciples in the eyes on one occasion, and he says to them, in this world you will have, and we wish he didn't say that. Like we wish he would have said, in this life, you will have you'll have ease, and it'll be like a really simple, but he doesn't say that. He says, in this world, you will have trouble. So some of you may be in the room today need to stop beating yourself up and taking on that guilt on yourself, because actually, godly people sometimes experience tough times. And the second thing that I'd like you to see from the text is almost the way that you consider your needs, like your troubles. Because I think we should start to see our needs as a starting point rather than a stopping point. You know, sometimes we see our problems and we think, that's the end. Hey, it's the end of me. It's like I'm facing this trouble. Nothing good is going to come. What if we change that? Instead of thinking this is the end, we might be able to say this is the start and actually believe that God could do something with us and through us despite the troubles that we face. You know, most of us, I think, probably want a miracle, but none of us want to be in a situation that necessitates one. You know, most of us say, God, I need a miracle from you, but none of us actually want to be in a situation that needs a miracle. Sometimes our lowest point can be the greatest moment, because it's in that moment that God steps in and does a miracle in our lives. So often it's through the trouble that then we experience God in a new way. And so your need or your trouble isn't the end point. Like, you need to hear that today. It's not the end point. It's the starting point for God to work. And so the widow in our story, she's at her lowest point, but it's a starting point for God to act. And then we turn to verse 2, and we're just going to walk through the text today. It says, Elisha replied to her, how can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house? Your servant has nothing there at all, she said, except a little oil. I love the way that Elisha starts the conversation here, because he doesn't start talking about God's resources, which could be a surprise. He starts talking about the widow's resources. And he asks the widow, what is it that she's got in her house? Because Elisha knows that when she starts to see what she's got in her house, God is capable of multiplying it. But the widow can't see anything. Like he says, what's in your house? And she says, there's nothing there at all. And then after a little extra thinking, she says, well, I do have a little bit of oil. Can we just pick up on those two words, nothing and little? Because they're not actually the same thing. How many of us, when we sense that something isn't going quite right in our lives and we need God to do something, and God asks what we've got, we say, I've got nothing. I've got nothing to give. And then God almost has to nudge us a little and says, look closer, because you will actually be amazed as to what I can do with a little that you've got. Because little is not the same as nothing. I love what's happening with our young people here at Elim. when we're thinking about a group of our young people going to Limitless Festival this coming summer, it's, well, I guess 5 or 6 weeks away. We have a record amount of young people and youth team who are going to summer camp to Limitless Festival this year. And each of our young people, they need to raise £170 to do that. That's a lot of money for a teenager. But rather than sitting around waiting for the miracle to happen, I love how they're looking in their house to see the little that they have, and then they're seeking to multiply it. And so yesterday, in our car park, a group of our young people discovered that they could wash cars. I mean, I don't know how well they wash the cars, but they discovered that they could wash cars. And I love that because they're not saying, I've got nothing. They're saying, I've just got a little bit that I can give. And hey, if I can give or do just a little bit, isn't it possible that God could multiply that? Or my parents could multiply that. But isn't it possible that God could multiply that and provide? You see, when you need a miracle, God first says, what is actually in your house right now? Because I can actually use what you've already got. And if we place the little that we have in the hands of an almighty and powerful God, we'll probably be amazed with what he can do with it. He takes 5 loaves, 2 fish. It's the little that a little boy has, and he multiplies it to feed a great crowd. The story continues, verse 3. Elisha says, go around and ask your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. I love this bit of the story because the widow then leaves her home and she goes knocking door to door down her street. And she asks that her neighbors would give her some jars that she will eventually come to understand is part of the miracle. So it makes me wonder, are there any empty jars in the room today? Maybe some of you just need to have a little look under your chair. Is there an empty jar or two in the room? I'm so glad on the front row, my friend Nelson has got an empty jar. Thank you, sir. Anybody else got an empty jar? Because the widow in the story, whoa, let's hope it stands up. The widow in the story, keep looking there. Thank you, Lavina. You're so good to me. Anybody else anybody got a jar? See, the widow has got, thank you very much, sir. Anybody got a jar? Thank you. Oh, Michelle, that's a larger one. Anybody got a jar? Thank you. You're helping me. These are my neighbors. Thank you. Thank you. Whoa, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I love this. Wow. Thank you. Is there anybody got, yeah, thank you. This is working better than I thought. Anybody else got a jar back there? I love that. Young man, you've got an empty jar. Thank you. Yeah, a round of applause. Is there any more? Is there any more? Looks about it. So this widow, she goes door to door, knocking on her neighbors' doors and asking for jars. And she has no idea why she's asking for these jars. And the neighbors have no idea why she is asking for them. But one of the things that they discover is that they are going to play a part in the miracle that this lady experiences. Did you know something today? That you can play a part in somebody else's miracle. Because there will be people in your life who are praying for something. There'll be people in this city who are praying for a miracle. There'll be people around the world who are praying, God, would you send a miracle? And it's quite likely that you can play a part in answering those prayers. Did you know that God works incarnationally? That means that he uses ordinary people to answer the prayers that people are praying. It means that actually you can play your part. You can be the hands and feet of Jesus in this world. It's actually quite possible that you could be the agents of change. So when you give a financial gift, when you cook somebody a meal, when you give somebody a phone call, when you provide somebody with some clothes, it is actually possible that you are playing a part in the prayer that somebody has been praying. And so the widow gets her neighbor, she knocks on their doors, she collects the jars, big and small. She has no idea why she's doing it. The neighbors have no idea why they're doing it. It's just that God had told her to do it, which, by the way, is a great explanation as to what faith is. Like, faith is preparing some jars without knowing what God wants to do with them. Like, it's doing what God tells you to do, even though you don't know why he's telling you to do what he's telling you to do. I mean, that's faith. I mean, have you ever had one of those moments where God has asked you to do something and you have no idea why, but the way that you demonstrate your faith is just in obedience, and you submit and surrender to his will and you just do it. You have no idea why. It's just an act of faith. So that's what this widow does. She prepares as many jars as she possibly can, and she loads the jars into her house. She has no idea why God tells her to do it. And then the miracle starts, verse 4. It says, then go inside, these are the words of Elisha, and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side. She left him, and afterwards shut the door behind her and her sons. She brought out the jars to her, and she kept pouring. So I love how this miracle takes place behind closed doors. There's no TV cameras. There's nobody posting this on social media. The prophet isn't a showman. He isn't like a charlatan. Like, this is all happening in the privacy of their own home. And in the privacy of their own home, God is about then to perform a miracle. You know, for the first 11 years of my life, my dad, was an itinerant evangelist. Some of you probably have no idea what that means, but it just meant that he traveled around the UK preaching, taking missions, doing evangelism and so on. For the first 11 years of my life, my father didn't have an income in terms of like a salary. We just lived by faith, and that was literally how it was. There were times where we didn't have anything, or there were times where the amount that we had was really small. We had no debts, but we also had very, very little money. And my parents would always be praying for God's provision. And there were many times where, as a child, we'd hear a knock on the door, we'd open the door, and there was nobody there, but on the step was a bag of food. Nobody took a photo. Like, nobody was posting it on social media, even though that didn't exist in the 1980s. But we knew behind closed doors that God had provided for our family. And that's how it happens in the text. This widow is about to experience an abundance of God's provision, but it's going to happen in the privacy of her own home. It's not under the spotlights. It's not on a stage. It's just happening where she is with her family in her home. And so the widow lines up all the jars, and she starts pouring and pouring and pouring. And then she pulls another jar in and she starts pouring, and another jar in, and she keeps pouring, and she grabs another one and she grabs another one until as many of the jars are filled as she possibly can to the brim. Which means I just need to point something out to you that is really obvious, but it's worth saying. That if there's going to be a filling, there first needs to be an emptiness. If God is going to fill something, or if God is going to fill someone, then they first need to be empty. There has to be a void of some kind. It's really obvious, but it's impossible for God to fill something that is already full. There's a phrase, isn't there, that sometimes we use to describe people. People who are arrogant and people who are egotistical, we say that they are full of themselves. They're so arrogant that they don't need anybody else's help. They're self-sufficient, they're independent, they're full of their own importance, they're full of themselves. And do you know something? That is the exact opposite of what God is looking for. God is looking to fill emptiness. He's looking to fill people who are aware of their own emptiness before God. People who will go before God and say, God, would you fill me? Because my life is empty without your touch. Like, God, would you fill me with your power? God, would you fill me with your presence? God, would you fill me with your peace? Because my life is empty unless you fill me. And so the widow brings all the empty jars. Each one is filled with oil. And then the miracle stops. Verse 6. When all the jars were full, she said to her son, bring me another one. But he replied, there is not a jar left. And the oil stopped flowing. Again, it's an obvious statement to make, but the miracle was limited by the amount of jars that the widow had. How many jars do we have here? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. This is a miracle that contains, it's like 23 jars worth of miracle. But that 23 jars is the limitation on the miracle. Because my level of preparation determines the level of outpouring. So if the widow has 20 jars, God would have filled them. If the widow had 120 jars, God would have filled them. The quantity of empty jars was, of course, the limiting factor on the miracle. I wonder how many times we've brought 3 jars to God and we've wondered, oh God, would you even fill 3 jars for me? And God's response to us is almost, well, I actually thought of 30. I wasn't really thinking of 3. I was actually thinking of 30. How many times have we placed a limitation on what God can do in our lives just because our expectations were just a bit too low? How many times have we brought God 5 empty jars and God had 50 in mind? We must always remember that our God is a God of abundance. He's not a stingy God. And that, of course, is where the final verse of the text takes us to. In verse 7, she went and told the man of God, and he said, go sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left. I love the way that God's provision covers the widow's debts so then she can keep her 2 sons. But then if you look carefully in the story, there's more than enough for that family to live on. God doesn't just give enough, he gives more than enough, of course, because that's how he operates. He's the God of the abundance. And so we should very rightly lift our expectations to say, God, I'm not just going to believe for the tiny, but I'm going to believe for the immeasurably more. So as the band rejoin me on the stage, let me just remind you of 2 verses that we've been speaking about and praying about over the last few weeks here at Elim. We've been talking about Isaiah 55 that says, as high as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways and my thoughts than your thoughts. And then we've been talking about Ephesians chapter 3 that says he's able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine according to his power that is at work within us. And we've been talking about those 2 verses because we believe that the God we serve is an incredibly big God. And he loves to give abundantly to his children, whether that's physically or spiritually. And we've taken you to those verses because we wanted to remind you to expand your imagination and prepare for the immeasurably more. To prepare for the immeasurably more, because God is looking for people who will prepare a whole load of empty jars to fill. He's looking for people who will increase their level of expectation. He's looking for people who will say, 23 jars is not enough right now. Yeah? Like we need some people who will say 23 jars. I mean, it's 23 jars, but it's not enough right now. We need to prepare some more. Because faith looks like something. Faith has action attached to it. And so our lives should look like preparation for all that God has next. And so can I give you one final verse as I finish? I love this verse. It's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 9. I, on the screen, don't remember it quite this way, but it goes something like this. No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love him. It's a beautiful verse, isn't it? And we're going to cling on to that verse because there's no eye that has seen, and there's no ear that has heard, and there's no mind that has conceived what God has prepared for those who love him. And I need you to know before you leave church today that yes, you are called to prepare for what God has for you, but he's also preparing something for you. And the thing that he's preparing for you is so much greater than the thing that you could get your mind around, because it's not even possible that the human mind could understand what God has prepared in advance for us. And so your job today is not to try to understand what God is going to do. Your job is just to be ready to receive what he's going to bring your way. Because it's not for you getting your mind around it. It's actually for you to say, God, I am so grateful that you have prepared something for me, and I'm just going to be prepared to receive it. And so today, folks, we make room, don't we? We make room for God to come. We posture our hearts today and say, God, we need more of you. God, we are saying to you today, God, would you expand our expectations? God, we're saying to you today, would you enlarge the capacity of our hearts? Because we're going to prepare for all that God has next for us. And in order to prepare, there's something has to empty in us, because we say to God, God, I'm emptying myself of my arrogance. I'm emptying myself of my self-sufficiency. I'm emptying myself of my independence. And God, in this empty vessel, I'm praying, God, would you fill me, fill these people, fill this community, fill this church with the overflow of the oil of your Spirit, because we're making room. We're preparing for you to come. Amen? Amen. Would you stand with me? I really wish, I guess there may be towards 300 or so of us in the room. I wish everybody had a jar, but we don't have 300 jars. We have 23, and that's not enough. So we're going to create our own little container. It's with the two hands that you have in front of you. And this is your container. And you're going to say to God as we pray, God, in my empty container, I'm asking you to pour out your presence, pour out your provision, pour out your power, pour out your peace. For some of you in the room today, it's time for you to expand your capacity and say to God, God, I am ready for the immeasurably more. For some of you, you need to prepare for the thing that God has told you is going to come, and you need to get ready. He's saying to you today, it's time to get ready. It's like it's time to get ready. He's spoken to you. He's given you a promise. And today he says to you, it's time to get ready. It's time to prepare. And with openness, with a void, with an emptiness, you're ready to be filled. And so shall we start just in this room together? Let's just start to break the sound barrier. And let's start to pray our own prayers to God. Prayers that say, God, would you fill me? God, I'm expecting you to do immeasurably more in my life. Let's just start to lift our voices in the room. Let's break through. Let's break the